Tanya from Financial Express, and we have today with us Mr. Naushad Forbes. He is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall and former president of CII. So today we'll be talking with him about his book, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential, and around various economic challenges and economic activities in India, and what can nation look at, or what can nation really do to prosper, or as Mr. Forbes call it, to become the potential leader of the world. Is that right, Mr. Forbes?
Exactly. Exactly.
So, first, very basic, we want to know what are the biggest economic challenges that you feel is the nation facing recently or currently, and what can the government do to make the situation better?
So, we have, I think the best way of thinking about the biggest challenge is to think in terms of timeframes. So if we think in terms of the immediate short term, the immediate short term is to get back on our earlier trend line of growth because of the pandemic, which has been affected because of the pandemic. As you know, in 2020-21, growth was -7%. In 2021-22, it's expected to have been about 8.5%. So we've recovered from the pandemic and the effect of the pandemic and the lockdowns associated with the pandemic. But we're still back now in March, April 2022, when back where we were 2 years ago. So we've, in a sense, lost 2 years of growth. So the first thing that we need to do in the short run is to get back on our pre-pandemic growth line. So if we were growing at, even if you take a modest rate of say 5-6%, we have to get back on a 5-6% growth path, which means and make up for the 5-6% that we've missed last year and the year before. So that's the first challenge. The first immediate challenge is to recover to the pre-pandemic growth path. The only country that's really done that, by the way, is the US. And it did that through a massive support program all through the pandemic, a very, very expensive, massive support program. But as a result, they've come through the pandemic in really good shape, actually, as an economy. That's the immediate task. The longer term task is actually, and the longer term challenge for us in India is, how do we put millions and millions of people to productive work in good quality jobs? To me, that's the single big long-term challenge. Because if we can move people, literally hundreds of millions of people out of low productivity jobs in agriculture and informal services and into more productive formal sector jobs, that will trigger a growth miracle for India for 30 years, and it will trigger a growth miracle for the world for 30 years.
When you say about job creation, which sectors do you think can create maximum jobs in India, and how can we, skill our workforce? We have a tremendous workforce, but then majority of them are not skilled. So how do we go about that?
So very much so. We have a very unskilled workforce. Less than 4% of our workforce is formally skilled, compared with over 90% in, say, South Korea, for example. So we have a long way to go in skilling. The real potential, it seems to me, an area where we have generally not done so well is in creating manufacturing jobs. Today, out of a workforce of 400 million, only 30 million people are employed in manufacturing. Small firms, large firms, only 30 million people. That's a tiny number. And you take, say, for example, China. China employs well over 100 million people in manufacturing, same population as ours, well over 100 million people employed in manufacturing. If you take even our neighbors, Bangladesh, much higher proportion of the workforce is employed in manufacturing than in our country. And so manufacturing remains a big employment opportunity if we can get labor-intensive manufacturing moving in the country. And that means, a much more successful, vibrant, supported garment industry, footwear industry, food processing industry. These are the labor intensive sectors. And then coming to services, it seems to me, and I talk about this a lot in the book, the big potential is in travel and tourism. And while that's been really hit during the pandemic, as it bounces back, as it comes back, and it's already come back in some force in March and April. I mean, you just need to try to take a flight and you'll see that every flight in the country and internationally now is full. It's packed. I think travel and tourism is on its way back. And travel and tourism, if we get tourism right, it has the potential to create millions and millions of good quality jobs for many, many years to come. Tourism is too small an activity, an economic activity in our country relative to our potential, given all of what we have that makes us such an attractive tourist destination. We're country number, 20 or 25 in the world tourism rankings. And we should be country number one. We've got everything that it takes to be number one.
When you mentioned manufacturing, how do you think India's manufacturing sector is gaining traction? And do you think very soon or in the times to come, we can be closer to calling India a manufacturing hub, or even employing a lot of people in the manufacturing sector?
So those are two questions. Because they have different answers. Can we be a manufacturing hub in certain sectors? Yes, absolutely. And I'll talk maybe about a couple of potential sectors. And can we employ millions of people in manufacturing is a different question. That's a maybe answer. So the first one, in terms of, can we be a manufacturing hub? We already are for certain product ranges. So for example, specialty chemicals is an area where we are increasingly successful as a country. We're part of global supply chains, increasingly so. Pharmaceuticals, we're very much a part of global supply chains. And very much a player in the world manufacturing scenario. Auto components, we have a long way to go, but we're starting to be certainly at the lower tiers of supply, and we must try to move up in terms of supplying more sophisticated sub-assemblies and so on to the auto sector. And we have the potential to emerge as a major auto manufacturer and auto exporter as well. We already export some part of our output. We are a large exporter of motorcycles, two-wheelers, for example. Bajaj Auto exports over half its output to countries around the world. So there's lots of scope in many of these sectors. Some sectors we struggle. So in textiles and garments, where we have traditional strengths as a country, we're a bit player. We're a very small player. And we could be a much bigger player. And as the garment industry moves out of China, it's moving to Vietnam, it's moving to Bangladesh. It's not really moving to India. Only if we're not that hospitable a place for labor-intensive manufacturing for various reasons, partly because of labor laws, partly because I think our own entrepreneurs have grown up with a mindset that employing a lot of people is a bad idea. We have a mindset of, I think, labor saving and of capital using for various historical reasons, relating to decades of very restrictive labor practices. So, and I think the laws are starting to change. It will take a while before that mindset changes, because that mindset has been built up over 50 years. And it's going to take years before that mindset changes and people start seeing labor-intensive manufacturing as an attractive business opportunity. So I would say, to answer your question, again, can we be a hub of global manufacturing? Yes, very much so in many sectors, I think, and we already are in some. We can be much more so in others. Will we be a labor-intensive manufacturing center where millions of people get put to work in manufacturing? That's a maybe answer. It depends on whether we address some of these policy issues and then some of these entrepreneurial mindset issues, which need to change for that to happen.
Right. So moving more closer to the book and what it talked about, the struggle and the promise, what would you call the highlight of the book? And if you had to summarize it in fewest words possible, how would it go?
So I would say roughly as follows. That we as a country have always, it seems to me, been a country of great potential. But to achieve that potential, we need to recognize certain essential features of us as a country. First of all, we need to recognize a few things. One, that we have a young and aspirational population. This is a great strength. We're going to have a share of the working age as a share of the population is going to be amongst the most attractive in the world for the next 25, 30 years. That's what we call our demographic dividend. But it'll be a dividend only if we can skill people, educate people really effectively so they can participate in modern growth processes. So we have an opportunity, but we also have a challenge, which is how do we educate everyone really well, ensure that everyone finishes school with a good schooling, that they come out of school with a good education, and then they get skilled so that they can participate in the modern economy, the point that you made earlier. Second, we have a very active and vibrant and diverse private sector. And we need to recognize that the private sector needs to drive the economy forward as it has been for the last 31 years, since 1991. And discretion should be decided, making economic choices should be choices that the private sector makes, not the government makes. So less discretion in the government when it comes to the economy, more discretion in the private sector, more choices being made in the private sector. Third, we have a very vibrant and large NGO sector. And this NGO sector can hold industry to account, it can hold government to account. I think in recent years, we've tried to control the NGO sector instead of encouraging and freeing them and wanting them to do more. Does this mean that every NGO is a great NGO and doesn't do something bad? No, there are bad apples in the NGO sector as there are in every sector. Right. But we should make our laws on the basis of good NGOs, not on the basis of bad NGOs. And then fourth, I think we need to recognize that in a country as diverse as ours and with limited state capacity, limited government capacity to implement policy on the ground and deliver results on the ground, the role of the state has to be limited. It has to be a limited role that focuses on a few areas and doesn't try to overstep the areas in which it works. I think if we address these kinds of things, then we can limit our struggle and deliver on the promise. If the state tries to do too many things, and because it tries to do too many things, it does them badly, then we struggle. If the private sector doesn't do enough and doesn't play its leadership role, we struggle. If the NGO sector is suppressed instead of encouraged, we struggle. So I think there are many opportunities, but to capture them, we really need to recognize what is the essence of us as a country, as an economy, and what will lead to that kind of success.
You mentioned in length about the role of state and the government into the functioning of the private sector and the relationship between industrialists and the government, and how government is, I think, not open to taking criticism. So what are your expectations there from the private sector, from the industrialists or the corporate houses of the country? How do they bypass all these bureaucratic processes, or not bureaucratic processes, let's say the role of government or the state in the overall functioning?
So, the role of the state should be, the state should be to enable, as opposed to control and decide. So the role, so that's, by the way, my concern with things like the PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme. because there you have the state deciding that these are the right products to make, right, for the country.
Right.
Deciding which product to make is a commercial decision. It's a decision that should be taken by industry, not by the state. Yeah, and the state should enable and encourage, and it can support and it can suggest, but it should not decide. Right? So yeah, so I'm saying that those are the kinds of areas where if the state plays too much of a role, too active a role, I think we end up struggling more than we need to. We can be much more successful if we leave those kinds of decisions to private enterprise. Now, you referred to, what should, how can industry speak? What should it talk about, etc. I believe very strongly that we need a private sector that is completely independent. Independent means that it's willing to praise the government when praise is called for, and it's willing to criticize the government when criticism is called for. That's what an independent company or an independent industrial sector or industry association or any independent institution should do, right? It should have a position that is independent of the government's position. The government's position, because the government's position may be right, it may not be. And if it's not, and even if you are wrong in your criticism, you should be free to express that criticism. You can express it politely, you can express it rudely, but you should be free to express it.
But how practical is that? Like currently in the current scenario?
It happens in countries around the world. Why shouldn't it happen here?
That's a good question, but
yeah.
we were still finding the answer for that. Anyway, so moving on, you talked about how India has the potential to become a world leader, but given the political situation, the geopolitical situation, and the economy, how it's going, and everything that's happening, is it practical an approach? And do you think India can become a world leader? And what do you really mean when you say world leader?
So world leader involves different principles, as I talk about in the book. So there's, without question, you need a degree of economic leadership. You need economic success, because without economic heft, you don't get taken seriously. Our minimum requirement is to catch up with where China is today in the next 20 years. So that means we need to grow at 9% a year for 20 years, right? And if we grow at 9% a year for 20 years, we will have a GDP that is about the size of China's. The economy will be about the size of China's in 20 years' time. But the size of China's today, not the size of China in 20 years, because China won't obligingly stay still while we catch up with them, right? So they'll keep growing, but they'll grow more slowly. And if we catch up with where they are today in 20 years, then after that, we can keep growing and catch up with them with where they are at that time eventually. So that's the first thing, the first challenge. How do we have a really vibrant, successful economy? Because that's what will give us the capacity to lead, if you like, the heft being taken seriously enough. Then there are several other things that go into leadership. You need a private sector, any country that leads tends to be private sector led. And why? Because you're just you're seen as a more benign, attractive presence. And India is. We're seen as a country that is welcome around the world. We're not seen with suspicion. We're not seen with, we have to be afraid of what they're going to come and do. Indian industry is welcome. It's actively sought in countries around the world. We have to use that welcome to be much more active in what we do around the world. And there's a real need then for industry to invest in international markets and to invest in technology. So the third thing is industry needs to be much more active in investing in industry, investing in international markets, so that we can participate in those development processes. And the last thing is recognize our culture as a great strength. We're an open, tolerant, relatively speaking, an open and tolerant culture, where we have something in the country with our diversity. We have something that everyone finds attractive. Use that to the maximum possible. Use our soft power to the maximum possible, because we are seen as a country that's enjoyable for people to visit, that's welcome because of the principles that we have followed in the past. And these are things that are soft elements that make us an attractive place. Indian film, music, cricket, all of this is seen as a force for good and something that's attractive that others want to participate in. And we should use that to the maximum and operate in a way that's consistent with that.
And so you also said that India needs another reversal in its trade policy from protectionism to an outward-looking policy. So what kind of steps are we looking at or expecting from the government in this front, and what's really needed or required?
Well, as I said in the book, that from 1991 to 2017, the trade policy kept improving. We kept becoming more and more open. Tariffs were coming down, more and more items were freed for imports. And as economists argue, a tax on imports is actually a tax on exports. So as tariffs came down, import tariffs came down, exports also boomed. And between 1991 and 2012, which was the high for exports, trade, imports plus exports, went from 15% of GDP to 55% of GDP. 55% of GDP is huge. It was well ahead of China, way ahead, double the US at that point in time. Since 2012, trade has fallen back as a percentage of our GDP. And it's still higher than China and the US, but it's not as much higher as it used to be in 2012. And today, it's about 40% of GDP now, which is still decent. But most people say that the slowdown we've seen in the economy in the last 10 years or so, it can be almost entirely explained by the decrease of exports in our GDP. Sajid Chinoy from JP Morgan shows that the entire slowdown actually can be explained by this slowdown in exports in the last 10 years. So we need to change things around. Since 2017, by the way, we've seen an increase in tariffs. Apparently, over 3,000 of the most imported items that we have, we've seen increases in tariffs, sometimes repeated increases in tariffs. And many of these increases in tariffs seem somewhat, I would use the word capricious. They seem somewhat, random almost, that one product has 20%, one is 15%, one is 10%. Why those differences? Difficult to tell, right? And it's those increases in tariffs that need to now reverse again. Because I think when they reverse again and we keep going back to being a more and more open economy, we will simultaneously, I think, become more of an export-led economy.
And lastly, summarizing everything, I think we got a crux of what you mean when you talk about India as a potential leader of the world and the economic situations and everything. So I wanted to know, is there a timeline? Do you have a timeline when you think India will recover from the impact of COVID and other economic uncertainties and everything? And there will, when do you really see India as a potential leader, if we must say?
So leadership is a long-term project. We should think in terms of a 30-year project, right? And it's not that you will not see any signs before that. You will, but it's a path to leadership. And I think the first step should be of wanting to co-lead the world before one wants to lead the world. So the first step is getting together with like-minded countries that also believe in the phrase that we like to use, a rules-based international order. Yeah. So, a belief and support of multilateral institutions. These are the things that we keep talking about, saying this is what we believe in. Well, let's back it up with some collaboration with Germany and Japan and South Korea and Singapore and Indonesia, and other countries that also believe in that same principle of a rules-based international order and multilateral institutions. And that then means that we should have a common voice when it comes to how to reform the WTO, the World Trade Organization, how to reform, if we need to, the World Health Organization, how to work with the UN. So all the multilateral institutions that really between them make up sort of the structure, the framework for countries to engage with each other. And where we then start saying that, look, between us, we're all going to subscribe to this set of conditions, and there are other countries that can join in, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that can join in as well in the same rules-based international order direction. So, and you become then more and more a spokesperson for that kind of a perspective. Now, that means also that we'll be held to a higher standard than the rest of the world. So, we shouldn't complain when we're held to a higher standard than the rest of the world. We should expect it, we should be proud of it, and we shouldn't be touchy about it. Sometimes we're too prickly with any kind of criticism. Yeah. And as we find our voice in international affairs more and more, and people look to us and they start saying, what does India think? What's India's view on this? What's their perspective? I think it'll start carrying more weight. And over time, as our own economy grows, as we become a much larger economy, then maybe we can aspire to also lead more on our own. But I think the first step is, as a part of a group of like-minded nations, and then next step is more on one's own.
Great. And that was an interesting list of countries we just named. So thank you so much, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Thank you.